Hi, y'all. It's Barbara from Divine Creative Love, and this is actually a very special video. It's the first time I've done a viewer request. One of y'all asked for a video about stamping, so I put together this beginner's guide to stamping in your Bible journaling. I hope it's super helpful, not just for the person who requested it, but for any of y'all who are curious about how to get started with stamps in your Bible journaling. Okay, so first things first, I have to talk about the difference between the old school wood stamps and the newer clear stamps, because these are what I grew up with in the 90s. You would go to the craft store and buy just a single stamp already mounted on wood block, and it was kind of expensive and took up so much space. So thank goodness the clear stamps are the majority of what's available now. You can't get very many wood stamps anymore. And the clear stamps, they're just mounted on a clear sheet, and then you just pull them off and mount them on a block and use them and then put them back on the sheet. So they take up a lot less space than those old wood stamps. So if you're like me and you grew up in the 80s and 90s, maybe you remember those and how much space they took up. But this is one of my stamp bins, and you can see how many I can fit of those clear sets in there because they're so thin and they don't take up much space. So clear stamps are pretty fantastic. I have all of my old wood stamps from when I was in high school, but I never use them. So the next thing I like to touch on is just the difference between the quality of some of the clear stamps that you can find. So this set here was one of my very first stamp sets that I bought. I bought it at a craft store, and it's actually really cheap acrylic. So you can see like how flimsy this is. It's just not very good quality material. So if you ever see like a stamp set that says it's made of acrylic, that's the kind of material that these are. I can still use them, but they just don't cling to the stamp block as well, and they don't stamp as nicely, and they won't last as long. But the most of the stamps that I have are made of clear photopolymer, and that's what these are. These are from Creative Worship stamps, and you can see they're a lot denser and like kind of heavier, thicker, not heavier, but thicker material, and they stick really well. So that's good when you stick them on the stamp block, that they stick really well and they maintain their stickiness too. So they're just much better quality. And all of the stamps that Creative Worship Stamps sells are that high quality photopolymer. So you'll want to just look for that. If you're buying from another brand, just make sure that they're high quality photopolymer stamps. And these are the stamp blocks that you'll need to use the clear stamps. So they come in different sizes. You really don't need very many. I've only got these 3 that I use. Mostly I just use the small and the medium, and then every now and then I need the big block for like a bigger background stamp. And you can see how easy it is. You just take the clear stamp and then just stick it on the block, and it just adheres really well. And you stamp it, and then you can peel it off and then put it back on the sheet that it came on. It sticks back to the sheet, and then you can put it away. So just to recap so far, to get started stamping, you need the stamps and the block to mount them on, and you'll need some ink. So there's different types of ink. Right here I have the archival ink on the left and the pigment ink on the right. I really prefer the pigment ink. I especially like the Alt New brand that I just got recently that is very good quality pigment ink. You can see there it's marked pigment ink. Pigment ink is just a little denser, and it kind of sits on top of the paper versus sinking into the paper like a dye ink would. So that's one reason that I really like it. It's good for Bible journalings. It doesn't sink into the Bible paper. So you can see how it's kind of opaque. So it's also very good, like rich color. And excuse me while I get the ink off my finger. The only time I don't use pigment ink is when I want to like watercolor over it. There's sometimes when this archival ink is really handy because it's permanent, waterproof, like it won't run if you put a stamp down and then you want to paint over it with watercolors or something that'll, that might make the ink run. And you can see like the difference between this and the pigment ink pad. This one's more like a woven texture. I don't know if you can see that. It's not showing up very good on camera, but the difference is the pigment ink pads are more like a sponge, like they're kind of spongy, but that archival ink pad is more like a woven pad. So it's just a little different type of ink and different ink pad and the way it works. But the archival ink is definitely very handy for certain situations. I just don't use it nearly as often as I use the pigment inks. Those are definitely my favorite. Before we move on, I almost forgot to mention one of my favorite kinds of stamps, and the most handy thing to have is these alphabet stamps. So if you have a few of these different fonts and different styles of lettering, you can spell out just anything. Even if you don't have a word stamp, having those stamps is very handy. So now that we've covered the basics, I'm actually going to speed up the video here just to make it not as long, because this is going twice as fast as it actually took me. But I'm going to show you how to actually create a Bible journaling page with some stamps and all the different things that you can do with them. So I've already put a little bit of color on the page. You can see there it's not very noticeable, but a little bit of color. And then I'm just going to go in with some background stamps. And I've got this "Faith is being sure of things hoped for without seeing" stamp. And we're just going to stamp this little page on Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. And by the way, this is my Pocket NIV New Testament Bible, in case you're wondering. And you can see I took that little script stamp that kind of reminds me of like a historical document, which I thought was kind of appropriate for the Bible. And I'm just going to use it as a background stamp, but I'm going to do something a little different. I'm not using a stamp block. So you can see I just grabbed the stamp by itself and then just inked a little bit, and then I'm just using parts of it to stamp in the background in kind of a similar color to the background that I already had on there, like a turquoise color. So it's not standing out too much, and it's just going to be that little bits of script in the background, which is really cool. I just learned this technique, earlier this year, where you just don't even use a stamp block and you can just stamp like little parts of it, and it kind of makes a really cool, like a collage background. The only trick to it, I think, is just deciding when is enough, when do I have enough on the background and I should stop and not add any more. And then I just wanted to dry that background a little bit before going in and adding any more stamps. And then at this point, I remembered I forgot to show you what I used for the background, which is the gelatos. Two different, like blue and green gelatos is what I just smeared a little bit on the page. So next, we're going to take the "Faith is being sure of things hoped for without seeing" stamp, which represents Hebrews 11, verse 1. And we're going to stamp those on the page. So you can see I've got my small stamp block, and I just stick that stamp on there. And then just have to grab some ink. So I went with the royal blue ink. And again, it's pigment ink, which is my favorite. And then to ink the stamp, you just tap it up and down a few times to get the stamp really good and covered with the ink. And you can always test it first on a scrap piece of paper if you want to make sure. And then you just press it down on the page really firmly, and then just lift it back up, and then you got a nice, good stamp impression. And then I'm going to show you how I clean my stamps. So I always just get a paper towel and get damp with water. I keep that little squirt bottle full of water just handy at my craft desk. And then just use it to wipe the excess ink off, just so most of it is off. You can see it's still a little stained. And by the way, it's totally fine if your stamps are stained. It's depending on the color and the type of ink. Some of them may get stained and it still works just fine. And I'm just wiping that one off too. And then I'll show you later how I deep clean the stamps when I'm all done. But for right after, I just wipe the excess ink off. And then I can just set it aside there. And then moving on to the other stamp. And same thing, just tap it up and down, make sure it's good and covered. Sometimes I get ink on the block too, and then have to wipe that off, so be mindful of that. I never have figured out how to avoid that, getting ink on the block and on the stamp. And then just cleaning the ink off, just kind of make sure I get all the excess off. And I should mention, there's no right or wrong way to clean stamps. I've heard some people say they use baby wipes to clean it. You can buy like a chamois that's reusable that you can use to clean them. So there's different ways. That's just how I clean my stamps. And at this point, I decided to add that little graphic of the little eyelashes or the closed eyes to represent being sure of things hoped for without seeing. And for that, I got out some black pigment ink and just tapping that stamp up and down to load it with some ink, and then pressing it on the page. And I think that looks really sweet. Kind of gets the point across. And then I just clean that one off a little bit. And then I decided I wanted to add a little bit more to the background of the page. So I've got this other backgrounds textures set, and I decided to go with the brick background. So just peeled that off the stamp page, and then using the same technique that I used earlier without a block, I'm just gonna try this gray ink and see how that works out. And I really did just drop the stamp. And then you'll notice when I stamp it here, it actually didn't work out. It's barely visible. So I kind of went to plan B, got rid of the gray ink, and I'm going to try something different. I'm going to clean it off. And this is what happens sometimes in Bible journaling. You run into a problem, you have to kind of detour, change colors, change tools, go with the flow. So the gray wasn't working, and that's the only shade of gray I have. So I decided to try another technique that actually is good that I get to show you this. So you can, when you want to stamp something and you want to make it lighter, so I'm going to ink it up with the black ink, but I don't want it to be super visible, so I just stamp it off once on a scrap paper and then stamp it on the page, and then it looks more like gray that way. So that's another cool technique that you can do with stamps. So you can stamp the ink on it and then stamp it off on a scrap paper, and then you end up with a lighter impression. So I just added a little bit of bricks here and there on the page. Just kind of makes the background a little more interesting. And again, in this technique, it's kind of challenging in a way to know how much to add in the background, and then how much, when to stop. When is it enough? I was gonna add a little bit here and a little bit there, and deciding when do I have enough. It's just a little bit more, just one more. Okay, we're done. That really is the tricky part, is knowing when to be finished. So then I'm just wiping off the ink from that stamp, and then here in a minute I'll show you how to deep clean your stamps. And I just remembered, I forgot to mention earlier about gesso, because I always get this question of whether or not to use gesso in your Bible. So I actually did not use gesso in this Pocket Bible page. And I'll show you here in a couple of minutes what that looks like on the back side of the page. But next, we're going to clean the stamps. So you'll notice some of them still have a little bit of ink coloring on them. And what I do is I take a paper towel and just kind of dampen it a little bit, and lay out all the stamps side by side. And you'll notice these two that have the little blue tint to them, they still have a little bit of ink. And then I have this Alt New brand stamp cleaner. So a lot of my stamps are Alt New. So I got their stamp cleaner, and then just noting that if you use arc level ink, it has a separate stamp cleaner that's really good for cleaning that permanent ink off of the stamp. But this cleaner you just spray on. So I just spray all the stamps all at once. And then I take just another piece of paper towel that I use to wipe the ink and then clean her off. So some of the colors you might not really notice the ink coming off. Like it doesn't, like there's a little bit of like black you can see there. And then that one, you can really see ink residue on there. Maybe a little, maybe a little color. But then especially the ones that had the blue ink, since it's a darker, more like heavily pigmented ink, and you can see all that blue coming off. So that's why I like to use the stamp cleaner. And then if necessary, if you feel like there's still some ink on there, you can do it again, spray it a second time, and then try to get more of the ink residue off of there. So you can see that looks a lot better. And it's totally okay if your stamp is still stained a little bit, and that does happen, but to get the most of the ink off is the goal. And then some inks will stain more than others. So there's that cleaner again. And then coming back to the page, I'm going to show you what this looks like, because I did not gesso the page. I just made sure to use the pigment inks and not anything too heavy. So you can see that the faith did kind of show through a little bit, but nothing bled, so that's good. All those pigment inks and the gelatos that I put on the background, they were pretty light colored, and so nothing bled through. So you can get away without gesso depending on what kind of products you're putting on the page. And then I just remembered the last thing that I always do is to outline or highlight the verse. So that's what I'm doing right here, just using a colored pencil to highlight Hebrews 11 verses 1 and 2. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. I love those verses. It's a reminder that even when you can't see what God's plan is, you maybe have unanswered prayers, things that you just can't see, things that you have to put your hope in God for. And faith is being sure of things hoped for without being able to actually see them. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, be sure and subscribe to my channel so you won't miss any of my future videos. And we'll see you next time. Bye!